hymn stories, with another hymn story to talk about today. One that maybe you're not familiar with. You may have never even heard of the hymn. The hymn's called There Were 90 and Nine. It was written by a girl called Elizabeth Clephane. She lived way back in the 1800s, from 1830 to 1869. She had a bit of a sad life and ended up writing this hymn called There Were 90 and Nine. But let me take you to another story first of all. One afternoon in May 1874, two American evangelists, D.L. Moody and Mr. Ira Sankey, boarded a train in Glasgow and they were headed for Edinburgh. They were going to commence their second mission in the Scottish capital. On the platform in Glasgow, Mr. Sankey, who was the singer of the two, he bought a newspaper, and during the journey he looked through it in hope of finding some items of interest, maybe some news from home, from America. Just before reaching his destination, his eye caught some lines written in an unobtrusive corner on one of its pages. Let me just read two of the verses to you. There were 90 and 9 that safely lay in the shelter of the fold, but one was out on the hills away, far off from the gates of gold, away on the mountains wild and bare, away from the tender shepherd's care. Lord, thou hast here thy 90 and 9, are they not enough for thee? But the shepherd made answer, this of mine has wandered away from me. And although the road be rough and steep, I go to the desert to find my sheep. As Ira Sankey read the lines to his companion, Mr. Moody, it dawned on him just the preciousness of these words. His colleague, Mr. Moody, was actually so engrossed in writing a letter that he scarcely heard. So Sankey, should I say, he cut the verses out of the paper and placed them in his music scrapbook. On the second day of that never-to-be-forgotten meeting, it was at lunchtime, of this mission in Edinburgh, Mr. Moody spoke with all his fervour on the parable of the lost sheep from Luke chapter 15 in the Bible. Dr. Andrew Bonar then got up to address the audience. Mr. Moody whispered to Sankey, sitting by his side. He says, sing something that's appropriate. At the close of the meeting, what should he sing? Suddenly the thought flashed into his mind. Sing the words you read in the train. But he had no music. His heart went up to God and he prayed, for he felt that he must sing the words. So he sat down at the organ and he played, and the music came note by note, fitting the words of the poem that he'd read. It was the tune of an old plantation melody called A Wonderful Stream in the River of Time. Or no, A Wonderful Stream is the River of Time, should I say. And he'd heard it once in the southern states of America. He was helped of God to complete the first verse, then the second, then the third, and right through the whole hymn. What a close that was to the meeting. Hearts were touched, and they were moved by the love of Christ. And many lost ones were found by the shepherd, became Christians, got saved, repented of their sin, as the Bible demands. This remarkable story tells of the first occasion when that hymn was sung in public and when the tune was wedded to the words. Some years afterwards, a young Englishman from a lovely Christian home found himself in a hotel in Paris. He'd gone there to enjoy himself and get away from the influences of home, the restrictions of home. In the hotel he found lying on the table an English copy of Mr. Sankey's hymns. He had heard of Sankey. His sister Mary used to speak often of Moody and Sankey and had tried to influence him to attend their meetings, but he'd resented it. Nevertheless, curiosity caused him to flick over the pages, and he was arrested by the words which caught his eye. But one was out on the hills away, far off from the gates of gold. Perhaps Mary would say that about me, he thought. But he closed the book and went off to the opera, but he could not enjoy it. The words kept sounding and repeating themselves in his mind. He came back to the hotel, found the book again, and read through this hymn line by line. God was speaking to his heart. He knew then felt that he was the one that was far off from the gates of gold. God used the words of that lovely hymn, portraying the love of Christ for sinners as the means of his salvation. Now, the words of this poem that became a hymn were written originally by Elizabeth Clephane, as we said earlier. She was the third and youngest daughter of Andrew Clephane of Carlogie, the Sheriff Principal of Fife and Kinross, and he was a descendant of an old and honourable Scottish family. Elizabeth was born in Edinburgh on June the 10th, 1830. When she was 8 years old, her dad died. The family moved then to Ormiston, and she lived with her two unmarried sisters because her mother also died subsequently. She was a talented girl, though she was quiet and of a retiring disposition. Her biographer says, while still young in years, she learned the meaning of sorrow. Through the death of both parents, but this experience of bereavement, together with a weak physical frame, far from embittering her, added a sweetness and charm to her gentle spirit, and equipped her for the tender and gracious ministry of helpfulness which she won from the poor and suffering. They used to call her in Melrose the Sunbeam. She had three brothers. The eldest, named George, left home at the age of 23 and went to Canada. There he fell in with bad company, and as a result became a partner in a number of difficult, sinful things, vices. One morning, 9 years later, he was picked up from a roadside and carried to the home of a Dr. Much, where he died. When the tragic news reached the home of the three sisters in Melrose, Elizabeth was about 21 years of age. She was deeply affected. She retired to her room and she closed the door, and her heart was breaking and she wanted to give expression to those feelings. George had wandered from the fold. Had he been, however, beyond the reach of the shepherd? So taking pen and paper, she sat down in verse to write the words of the 99 song, poem as it was then, and when finished she took the manuscript, she locked it in her desk. She didn't want anyone else to see it. Some 17 years later, the words appeared in print in the Children's Hour publication. The manuscript had lain on her desk for all that time, and we don't know if it had been lost and the hymn rewritten by her. We don't know. It's difficult to ascertain. But she died on the 19th of February in 1869, and shortly after her death, the words of 90 and 9, together with some of other of her works in verse, received wider publication. An amazing hymn. Touched my family at one stage. I wonder if it would touch yours. I wonder if you would think of the shepherd, the good shepherd, who gave his life for the sheep. May God bless you. Thanks for watching this.